everyone, and welcome back. Today I am finally getting to a project that I have been putting off for about 2 months at this point, because it was put in the corner to think about what it did. A couple of months ago, I started a project of making a 1920s tailored suit for myself, and you might remember that I put out a video on making the vest portion of that. I did show trousers in that, but they weren't technically done. See, as I got near to the end of my trouser project, after having fought with this project for a good week, I realized there were some things that I had still done wrong, and I needed to put it to the side and come back to it later, just to give myself a break. So I'm finally back to those trousers, they are finally done, and we can finally talk about them. Now, I didn't mess these trousers up because I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing. I just was working on autopilot and kept doing the right techniques for the wrong trousers. And there's lots of variations on them, and depending on things like whether you have a waistband or not, make a big difference in how the rest of the construction needs to go, on how the pieces are cut out, or on how they are assembled, and what steps need to be done in what order. And I kept doing the wrong steps the wrong time, and putting them out of order, and just became everything had to be redone repeatedly. But what I really learned from this more than anything is the fact that trousers, despite the uniformity that they give off, are incredibly complex and variable items in terms of how they need to be constructed. The 1920s is especially great for this because it is a transitional period when it comes to men's trousers. You might look back at them and find that they look very modern. They tend to be rather slim-legged, similar height to what the modern trousers are like. They're very familiar. They're not antiquated in their appearance. And this is really because it was a transitional period into that more modern style. There are things such as waistbands that change throughout time. Earlier styles of trousers in, say, the late 19th century very often would not have an actual waistband. They would have a grown-on waistband, meaning that the actual fabric of the trouser, front and back, continue on up past the waist. These are the types that we're used to seeing along with suspenders. And this is the style that was very typical for more everyday to formal wear. There certainly were trousers that were meant to be worn with belts or have entirely separate waistbands, and those are around. They just tended to be a little more informal, a little more working class in a lot of cases. This really starts to shift at the beginning of the 20th century, and by the time we reach the 1940s, and that's when you start to see men every day with their regular suits wearing belts instead of suspenders, having a separate belt band with belt loops rather than the higher waisted styles, which become more formal. You'll still find them being used then with evening wear and formal things. There's just a transition during that early part of the 20th century, and the 1920s are caught up in that. So I specifically wanted to choose elements that were a little more on the casual, informal side, because I was going with a tweed fabric and I didn't feel like this was a formal suit. This also wasn't meant to be a more conservative, older style of suit, so I wanted to choose elements such as a stitched on separate waistband that signified that. And for me, all of this stylistic choice meant that I was doing things I didn't normally do. Most of the men's suits that I've made in the past have been relatively formal. I've made full-on tailcoats and all the parts that go with that. I've made morning suits. Those require more formal styles, and I've usually made trousers with grown-on waistbands and with no pockets in the back or just a nice, very clean little welted pocket. Instead, I chose things like a button fly instead of a zipper fly. I chose to actually stitch on a separate waistband and use a new technique for doing so. I decided to put in pocket flaps in the back and use a few other little elements that I didn't typically use, and I just kept forgetting what I was making, apparently. It doesn't help that a lot of the drafting manuals of the time don't exactly come with instructions. So while I can find lovely drafts of men's trousers, no one tells me how to put them together. I was able to find a little bit of instruction from the place that I actually got my drafting for these trousers, which is a magazine called The Progressive Tailor. And it came out seasonally, and there are definitely quite a few throughout the 1920s, though there are very few that I could find for free online. But the particular one that I was looking at actually had a very short article talking about trouser construction as well, that was just talking about the fly front and was meant to be part of a very long series, so I didn't have the stuff before or after. But I really loved those particular magazines because they are very clear in their drafting instructions, and they ask for all of the measurements I think they should ask for, and they are used in a logical way. We're not doing crazy proportions and assuming that the size of your waist tells you what the size of your thighs are, because it doesn't. So choosing the right type of manual is very helpful. If you've ever tried drafting and gone, this is awful, it may just be that that particular manual is not really conducive to actually understanding anything. A lot of them have typos and a lot of them skip steps, and just assume that you know what you're doing and you'll figure it out. But the Progressive Tailor seems to be geared towards teaching people new styles or teaching beginner tailors more techniques, and I really love it for that reason. So I highly recommend checking out. I do have some of the links to them below, and if anyone comes across more examples of this magazine, I would love to know. So what you're going to find throughout the rest of this video is me talking about the things that I did correctly and the things that I did not do correctly. I don't have video of all of my mistakes. A lot of times I will make up one side of a garment and then go back and actually film making up the second side, so that way I know what the steps are and what angles I need to get the shots from. So I don't have video of all of the things that I messed up, but I will talk about them and show you at the very least the correct way of doing these things. And we will all get to learn a lot, and that pair of trousers no longer has to sit in the corner of shame. And honestly, this is one of the reasons why tailoring can be so daunting. There's so many variations and there's so many different ways that you can do these things. And it's just a skill that has to be acquired with repeating this process over and over again until it becomes familiar and automated enough. And it is really hard to learn that way. You have to remember, tailors traditionally learn through apprenticeships, meaning that they get to sit down and have a very personalized experience with someone teaching them all of these skills. They don't have to go piece together and figure out the mystery on their own. And that is something that we've forgotten in a lot of the way that we teach things in modern day. But there are things like Skillshare out there. Skillshare is an online community full of thousands of creative classes you can take to learn exciting skills, grow creatively, or even find a new interest. I always say that the most important thing for working in a creative field is to keep learning and exploring. You never know what skills will come in handy. And I so often get questions about where to begin when learning a new skill like sewing or leatherwork, and this is such a great place for that. I've personally been digging into classes about photography, film work, and digital art to help expand my knowledge and improve the way that I communicate and share my artworks. Lately, I've been working with digital fabric printing. I started watching Introduction to Designing Repeat Patterns in Illustrator from Elizabeth Olwen, and I have been impressed at how much new and useful information she's been sharing. Dealing with repeats on digital images can be daunting, and her method was shockingly easy. The best part of all of this is it's on your schedule when you're ready to learn. For less than $10 a month with an annual membership, you get access to all of the classes available, and there's more released all the time. You don't have to sit through ads, you can stop and start on your time, and there's an entire community of other people taking the class along with you, sharing their projects and experiences. And the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a free trial of premium membership so you can explore your creativity. There's no reason to stumble through figuring out everything on your own. There's a whole community of people who have already tread that path and are excited to share their knowledge with you. So thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video and for enabling me to learn new things. I didn't make any massive changes to this drafting over what the original called for. I figured that most of the adjustment in terms of the hip to waist ratio that might be bigger than the quote normal man of the time is going to be adjusted in curving in the side seams a little bit at the waist or pulling in the dart at the back a little bit more. So I didn't want to make any massive adjustments to the trousers over what my measurements said they needed to be. And it does have you measure hip and waist and inseam and all sorts of other measurements. You might just need to make sure, depending on the particular instructions of the drafting that you use, that it does account for things like thigh size. If you're drafting this for a body, that sometimes has that as an issue. So there are some things to be aware of depending on how simplified they have the drafting pattern. In general, I find that I don't have to make a massive amount of changes to their overall shape in order to get it to fit my body. For the trousers, the first pass on these is not too bad. The bigger issue that I have is that this side seam right here is very curved. So that means that my front piece is too curved and my back piece is not curved enough. So I'll simply sort of bridge the gap between those and sort of pull it over about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 inch. Yeah, about 1/2 inch to make that more of a straight line up. I'm also finding that it's a little low in front. It's more of a tilt than I would like. It's not too low in the back, but I would like to bring it up just a little bit. And overall, it's a little bit bigger on the waist than I would like. It's the appropriate size waist for where it's sitting on me, but once I bring it up a little bit more, it's probably going to be too big. I don't feel like I need to make drastic changes to it though for that. The front is about right. If I do much more to the front, then I'm worried that I'm gonna start being too tight across the stomach. So I think most of the excess in the waist might come out of those back darts or out of something else in the back shape. So overall, it seems to fit pretty well. It's not too snug around the hips, which is always the bigger concern. It's not too snug around the high hip line, which is one of the areas that you really have to be aware of if you have a little bit more of a belly, because I feel like the front is correct, and that is where a lot of the construction that I have to do before I can do a fitting goes. And honestly, I can actually baste the trousers together before if I'm really worried about that, but because the leg fits pretty well, the seat fits pretty well, I can move in these. They pull down a little bit in back, so like I said, I just feel like I need a little bit more height, and then I should be okay. So we're just going to make those changes at the side seam, adjusting one section further out to one section further in, and then make a few adjustments to the size of the dart as well. From there, I'll cut the actual fabric out and start marking it with tailor's tacks. I didn't do this on my waistcoat because I wasn't going to be handling it as much, and it's a fairly small piece, it doesn't move around a lot. But when it comes to trousers or jackets where it's going to be handled a great deal, you want to mark with this system rather than chalk. And all you're doing is making very loose loops of a basting thread, and then you pull the two pieces apart and clip through those little ladder stitches. It just makes for tiny little basting tacks, which will come out fairly easily after you've done your stitching. The very first step of assembly is to do reinforcement at the fork. Yes, that is actually what they call that little section of the trousers where they meet at the inseam. It's an area that tends to get a lot of wear and tear, so a little square that is folded in half to make a triangle is usually fitted into just the front part of that little crotch seam. To finish it off, I just used a pair of pinking scissors, as I do for a lot of things in this. Next, we're going to move into dealing with the front pockets. Interestingly enough, this is the point where I start messing up. Yes, we've only made it like 2 steps in. I went ahead and marked out how far the pocket needed to be over in order to get the right curve. You can see I sort of cut a grown-on pocket facing in my trousers that will get folded over so that way it hides the pocketing from being seen. But we need to cut that curve, and I just messed up because I cut all the way down from the top, cutting off that seam allowance. And I should have left that little bit of seam allowance on the top in order to help finish off that seam later. The next thing that I'm messing up is that I'm going ahead and just basting the pocketing directly to my front. There's supposed to be a whole bunch of steps in between these two things, and I realized that fairly quickly, but I mean, you could simplify this down and not put anything there, but I really recommend putting a stay tape along that section first. The pocket's going to be dealing with a lot of wear and tear, and you want to make sure that it is very fortified, that it won't stretch out, especially since if you have a fairly curvy hip, it does have a little bit of a bias stretch to it. So all you do is take a piece of linen, beaded linen, or canvas linen, and it just needs to be on straight grain, and that just gets basted in and held into place as you eventually do all the stitching through it. I like to pull it just a little bit extra snug, which helps keep the pocket from gapping over the hip. We can then finally now lay down the pocketing and clip and push over the pocket facing that I talked about earlier. This just gets whipped down along its edge to the pocketing. You can do this as a zigzag on your machine as well, but since I'm doing most of this work by hand where I can, I chose to just whip over the edges to finish it off. And then at the very edge of the pocket opening, there's a either top stitch by machine or some sort of other top stitch by hand, and that will catch through that little bit of canvas that we use for reinforcement as well. Then we can fold the pocketing in half, and from there, curve out the bottom. I could go ahead and do all of the cutting and shaping on the pocket when I cut it out first, but I find it a lot easier to do it on top of the trousers, making sure that everything is matched up. It also means that I can double check that the size of the pocket is correct in terms of width, and that it's not going to interfere with the center front of the pants or any other area. So I'm just cutting the curve of the hip into the interior side of the pocketing, and now we will face that as well. This is a great place to just use a little bit of scrap. If your selvage edge is not really terrible, it's also a great place to use a little bit of selvage edge. Make sure everything is nice and flat before moving on to the center front, where we're dealing with the fly, which is, yet again, another place where I mess up. So there are two sides to the fly. One side will have the extension and the buttons, and the other side will have a sort of secondary facing with the buttonholes. So I'm starting with the side that's supposed to have the buttons, and this is the part where I mess up, because I'm putting in a little extension facing that is way too short. I forgot that I'm not doing a pair of trousers that has a grown-on waistband, and instead should be extending that facing all the way up to the waistband. Otherwise, it's just going to extend into nothingness. So I will have to replace that later, but I don't realize this until near the end of my project. One of the reasons I got put in the corner to think about what it did for a couple of months. For the other side, which was done correctly, this just has a little bit of a cotton facing, then you deal with a separate piece that gets added on that actually has the buttonholes. The fly is a little bit different than dealing with a zipper, and I really do like making button flies. They come out very flat and even, and I feel like I have a little bit more control over the work that I'm doing than if I'm trying to insert a zipper by machine. This piece that has the buttonholes on it does extend further up in order to deal with the sewn-on waistband. The facing ends before the waistband, but this piece will go up further and sort of face the front of that section, so it ends up really nice and clean on the interior. Moving on to the back of the trousers, the pocket flap is absolutely adorable, and I originally wasn't going to put canvas in this and started making it up as is, realized I couldn't get the right shape, it just really was not working for me, so I took all the work that I did out and put a little piece of the correct shape of canvas in there. It just makes it much cleaner and crisper around all of the edges. For the back, you want to make sure that you've marked out where your pocket needs to be before you've put the dart in, because the dart can sometimes, 1, go into the pocket area, and 2, curves everything, so it's a little complicated. For this, I'm going to have a little welt on just the bottom, and then the pocket flap will deal with the top section. Now, this is where I made my next mistake, or should I say a series of unfortunate mistakes. I started off by stitching the welt down to the bottom of the opening, and then I promptly also stitched the pocketing to the top of the opening. And what you're seeing here is me doing it correctly, which is to not stitch anything to the top of the opening because that's where the pocket flap will need to be inserted. So once I turned everything right side out, I went to actually insert the pocket flap and realized I could not do that. So I had to undo the pocketing off the top of the opening and reverse back to the beginning. Correctly though, you're just supposed to stitch that little strip of welt to the bottom of the opening. I put in a canvas interfacing to make sure that it does have enough support, since that pocket is going to get a lot of wear and tear. It's likely going to get weight like a wallet, so you want to make sure that it is well supported, and making sure that the welt doesn't warp is part of that. The other part of it comes with the rest of the pocket bag. Like I said, I went ahead and did the welt at the bottom, got that all stitched in nicely, finished it off at the edges, whatever needed to happen there, and the pocket bag will actually need to be pulled up to hang off of the waistband on the inside, not off of just the pocket opening. So that's a very important thing, because not only did I realize that I messed up, needed to remove the pocket bag, put in the pocket flap, because then my former self decided to just go ahead and stitch the top part of the opening, the pocket flap, and the top part of the pocketing all together at one time, because that'll be super fast, right? No. It was a terrible idea. I ended up with a really long pocket that hung down to my knees, and I couldn't understand what I had done wrong. But at least former Nicole did properly cut out the size of the pocket, because I realized, oh, it's supposed to hang from the waist. So what you see me doing here is laying the pocketing over the opening and where the flap is, pinning it and basting it into place, so that way as I hand stitch the pocket flap to the exterior of the trousers, I can also just stitch straight on through that pocketing, and everything will be nice and reinforced and kept closed. It doesn't need to carry a lot of weight, as the actual pocketing will be supported at that waistband like I mentioned, but it's better to not be able to just stick your hand all the way up in there. So once I did that, I stitched up the sides of the pockets with the pocketing folded correctly, and I pinked the edges to finish it off, because by this point I wanted nothing to do with these pockets and just wanted it all to be over, so I didn't feel like dealing with a nice French seam. So that's my recommendation, probably a French seam, but you can also just pink the edges and call it a day. As for the top of the pocketing, we will get to that once we get to the waistband. For the waistband, I am just using another strip of canvas. You could use something like a Petersham ribbon if you would prefer, but I'm trying the method that was recommended. Essentially, the top edge of the waistband is top stitched to the canvas and folded over. It makes it really quick and easy to finish off that edge without any visible stitching, since that will eventually be lined. This is also the point where I realized that I had messed up that one side seam, so the one that I'm showing you here is the correct way of dealing with the side seam, and actually still has a little bit of that seam allowance left that will allow me to cover up some of those raw edges. Another note here, the waistband is left unstitched at the center back seam. This split is just something I find regularly on trousers of the era, and that just seems to be how it's typically done. Now, here's where I get to play around with how I want to do that back pocketing. I initially start off by trying to make a dart in the middle, decide that's just not gonna fly, it looks a little bulky, it's getting a little bulgy. but I need to deal with the fact that it can't go straight up. There's a big dart in the actual trousers there. Instead, what I come up with, which I have seen in so many other places, so I don't know why I didn't think of that first, was to just fold back the edges so that way it angles up and it just falls flat and is less of a bulky issue there. It also means that the raw edges are now tucked under nicely. And so here you can see why I wanted to leave that little bit of extra on the pocketing, because it just folds over and covers up those raw edges. So I had to do some creative patching on the other side to get that to work. As I mentioned earlier, it's at this point near the end where I realize I don't have the correct length of fly facing. Thankfully, I hadn't done much work to it, hadn't put the buttonhole in it by hand, and so all I had to do was trace out a new one, extend it up 1.5 inches, and cut that out of some remnants of the fabrics. It wasn't too hard to put this back in. The only major changes that I have to make are to adjust the waistband so it's further back. Like I said, the reason for this is that that little tab, which is supposed to have a button underneath of it, needs to extend over at the waist where there's actually something to put a button into. Otherwise, if this tab is below the waistband, I would have to stitch the button directly to the exterior wool of the trousers and it would not pull in a good spot. The button is there to make sure that there's extra reinforcement at the point of stress at the waist, because it is under a lot of stress and tension. All of the trouser buttons for this are also stitched on with a thread shank. Makes it easy to deal with the thicker fabric. It's not necessary for every button, but if you have thick fabric, you definitely want a thread shank. And then the button fly portion also has a few tacks along the edges to make sure that it doesn't gap. And then the hem is just catch stitched up. It is a very curvy hem, so it does require a little bit of steaming, but the shape ends up curving up over the foot very nicely. Now, I know trousers can seem really complicated, so I figured I would give you a tour of everything that happened on the inside. So first off, we have that little fork that we talked about earlier. That's just that reinforcement down there. And then we get into the button fly, which has the extension piece that has the buttons stitched on, and the little inset eye, and the buttonhole, which all sort of flip across and attach to this panel, which is two separate things, the facing and the actual fly piece that has the buttonholes. There's the hook there, Every other buttonhole space is tacked down, so that way I can still get in there to button them, but that doesn't gap. And the attachment button for that little extension is right there. So that's what's happening with the fly. You can see they sort of extend down into the seam a little bit and get tacked down there, which helps reinforce that little front section of the seam since it can get a lot of wear and tear. There's also a little horizontal tack, so that way it's not likely to pull open and start to rip down the seam. Next is the front pocket, which has been nicely finished off with the French seam. You can see the little stitches from all of those facings. I really should probably pink this edge or whip stitch over it, and in reality, all of these seams on the interior of these trousers, the inseam and the outseam, I should either, well, I really should be whipping over them by hand. So I will probably go back and do that at a later date before these get worn very much, but just not right now. And you can see my little fix for the fact that I cut straight down the seam allowance there, and it's a raw edge and I can't just fold it over nicely. Put this little tiny piece of lining to cover that up. And then back here is this little dropped section, and that's the apron, and it's just there to sort of provide more wear and tear resistance and more comfort, and it also can cover up some of the wool if it's in an itchy area for people. So this is a really common thing, just an apron of some type in the back, because the front pockets pretty much cover up the entire front. The back pockets may not, and they aren't always there.